Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Josh Summers, and it's an honor to have your attention here on the Everyday Sublime podcast. Today, I'm joined by Miles Sherts, and we, in our ongoing series of discussions, explore the relationship between spirituality and politics, or specifically spirituality and democracy. What's the similarity or the structural similarities between the two? And I just want to say, given that we're less than a week away now from the United States presidential election, the stakes are very high. And as a special session for our Sangha, Miles is going to join us on Election Day, November 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a special live stream where there'll be a little bit of teaching, some guided meditation, and discussion within the Sangha. If you'd like to join that, if you're listening to this, go to our website, joshsummers.net, sign up for our newsletter. You'll get some complimentary practices of yoga and Qigong work to do, but you'll receive an updated email with a link for this live stream. So the live stream is on November 5th. It's Election Day. Check it out you can join us by joining my newsletter, and we'll send out on the day a link for the special live stream event with Miles Sherts. Okay, it's a crazy time right now. I'm feeling a mixture of anxiety myself, as I say in the show, and fear and numbness and terror and agitation and anger and despair. There's a lot of emotions alive. And if you want to be part of a community of people trying to make sense of what's happening, we invite you to join our Sangha, practice with our bodies, practice with our hearts, practice with our energies. And I hope you enjoy today's episode. If you do like it, do subscribe, share it with a friend. And without further ado, I now bring you once again, Miles Sherts, The Spirituality of Democracy. Just a quick note before I give you this episode. On the production side, there was a few issues with the recording. Miles got cut off a couple of times. So the second time that happened, we decided to call it the end to the episode at that point. So it does end a little abruptly. I'm aware of that, but I hope you'll get some of the core takeaways from this episode and apply them to your practice for this moment. Okay, here's the episode. Here's the talk with Miles. Hey, Miles, how are you doing?
Hey, Josh. Very good. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome back. Let me just briefly introduce us. I am Josh Summers. This is the Everyday Sublime podcast, and you are Miles Sherts, a communication coach, spiritual teacher, insight meditation teacher, and regular interlocutor on the Miles on the Path series of this podcast. So it's great to have you back. We've been having regular conversations now about every 2 weeks, and in particular, as we come in towards the U.S. presidential election in November, we've been discussing about the interface between personal spiritual practice and the kinds of in the world interpersonal communications conversations / tense conversations that come up. And just before we started taping today, I sort of raised maybe a broad question around the place for politics within spiritual practice discussion or specifically Sangha. Is it appropriate to talk about feelings and emotions and perspectives related to current events within a spiritual environment? And I wasn't looking to you for the right answer. It's more just opening up that conversation and see what you have to think about it.
Yeah. So one of the first thoughts that comes to mind, because the tradition you and I share, one of them is the Buddhist insight meditation tradition, and you and I both had a lot of experience in that tradition. So it's I don't consider myself Buddhist or a teacher of Buddhism. Buddha wasn't Buddhist, and I think we do better if we, not focus on the ism, the mindset or the set of teachings, but rather the experience. However, I think occasionally it's useful to reference to. And so in this case, what came to mind when you mentioned that earlier before we got on tape here is my understanding is Buddha was very clear when he set up the monastic communities that are now still active in throughout Asia, that the monastics were to stay completely outside of and separate from politics. And I've heard of it, I've seen it with my own eyes, and a good example of it is in Burma. There have been exceptions in Burma, but I've been to Burma, and it's a military dictatorship there. It's a very oppressive government. There's a very active resistance movement, and the monastics tend to just carry on. And in fact, it's the seat of what some people consider it sort of the seat of Orthodox Theravadan Buddhism, because it's been so unchanged for so many years. And I think in the Buddha's wisdom, what he was trying to
Can I just on that issue
yeah.
around Burma? Like, when were you in Burma? Where were you? And the broader context of Buddhism, a Buddhist practice in Burma, is interesting on the political front, because while I can see that on one level what you mean in that maybe the monastics in Burma don't get involved with their government, they're not resisting per se the military junta. I do know that the renaissance of practice in Burma at the turn of the 20th century was very much a grassroots, you could call it a political resistance movement against colonialism. So people like Mahasi Sayadaw and Lady Sayadaw explicitly started teaching to a lay community so that the practice and teaching would be preserved and not be eradicated by colonial occupation. Did you? That was all codified or written about in a book called The Birth of Insight by Eric Braun, which really not a lot of insight teachers that I've spoken to, like senior teachers, were aware of that historical development, but
Yeah.
it does. It's not black and white. It's not binary. It's not Buddhism was never political or it's always political. It's like there's dalliances in both sides of the aisle, I'd say.
Yeah, and one of the more recent uprisings. No, so I wasn't aware of that. I mean, the current situation in Burma has been going on for so long, and it's such a I don't know what the word is. It's uncomfortable there. I felt uncomfortable there because
When were you there? Was it?
oof, probably 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And there's just a palpable sense that there's a government that has control, and the people don't feel part of it. They're not, they're afraid of it,
Yeah.
and you could feel that. So that's been my experience of Burma, and I didn't dig into much of the history, but there is documentation that during one of the recent uprisings, maybe within the last 10 years, some of the monastics were involved.
Right.
So yeah, it doesn't mean that just because Buddhists set it up that way doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. But the interesting thing to me, and what I noticed in Burma, what I was trying to get to, was that by doing that, you could have regime changes, or you could have an oppressive military regime. And what is really interesting in Burma is the military regime leaves the monastics alone, for better or worse. I don't think they support them. I can't imagine they consider themselves Buddhist, but maybe they do. But the point is, because the monastics and the monastic system has been, let's say, apolitical, meaning not picking sides, just staying out of the fray, the powers that be tend to leave it alone. And I think that's what Buddha had in mind, was that the monastic system would be able to withstand, decades of military dictatorship, and that's exactly what's happening in Burma. So I think that from that perspective, remember that when at Buddha's time, it was a time of kings and feudal kingdoms, and the king or perhaps queen could just decide anything, make any rules they wanted to. So it was in the monastics' best interest, I think, to stay out of it. So they didn't risk the leader taking them apart. Having said all that, I think what we were talking about is slightly different. That the discussions you and I've had in our last session, we were leaning into a little bit the emotions that come up and the sense of all kinds of things, fear, anxiety around this coming election in the United States, which is now just a month away or less.
Mm.
And that is absolutely fodder for spiritual practice. So to ignore I've never seen my spiritual practice as ignoring what's going on in the outside world. And I have friends who tend to lean that way. They don't listen to the news. They find it too disturbing or just don't want to add that to they want to find a more sense of equilibrium that doesn't involve um, being aware of or hearing about atrocities and suffering. And I take a different view on that. I think knowing about the suffering that's going on around the world is essential to practice and to bring it right home now. The anxiety that people are feeling right now about this election, um, that's fuel for the practice. That's whatever's going on inside of us is what the practice is about. And if you're not having a reaction to the coming U.S. election, probably you're not paying attention, and maybe that's intentional. And sure, that could be fine. But to me, the practice is about not avoiding intensity or conflict or political tension. It's looking right at it and feeling it inside ourselves. Where am I experiencing this? And using that to be present, to be present with it, to notice. And how do I take care of myself when I'm feeling anxious? When I'm feeling anxious about this election, which I am, I do
You
think,
personally,
yeah,
you're
of
feeling
course,
things.
yeah, I pay attention. I'm paying attention, and uh, I think more than any election in my life, I feel a sense of unease. Let's say, stretching into anxiety about how the election's going to go, what's going to happen right afterwards, um,
I
and
don't want to get into a tangent too deep, but I am curious. Do you feel like, because I'm trying to compare and contrast, how do I feel in 2024 compared to how I felt in 2020 and how I felt in 2016?
yeah,
And it's not the same. And I can't even quite put my finger on what's different. A part of me, I feel a bit more rubbery, more even blown out. Like just I've been blown out and I can't quite put all my pieces back together again.
mm,
I think I might feel more numb. Um, and just in a more heightened state of disbelief slash not overwhelmed with the sense of this feeling of surreal, how surreal this is. So I'm just curious, like, how are you feeling if you were to sort of do a similar comparison and contrast between the last few elections that you've lived through and now? Are you noticing any changes or differences?
sure. I mean, I would agree with that. Like, as I just said, this is the most emotion I felt around any election in my lifetime, and I generally pay attention to politics, and I consider voting is a responsibility, and I take it seriously, and I've certainly felt you know tension or anxiety before, but not to this level. And so, yeah, this is I think we're at a. I mean, it's so easy to say, and this is just something that we would only know in hindsight. But it feels like we're at a real make or break point for democracy, for our the way that our government is structured and the way we do it. And I think that's being challenged. And I personally think democracy is really valuable as a practice. I consider democracy a spiritual practice. It's really difficult to do democracy. This is maybe a good tangent to spend a moment on here.
Yeah, I'm liking it. Go on.
All right, so democracy is the idea that we the people could make the decisions. We the people could be in charge. It's such a powerful idea that it created the United States, or the United States came out of that idea. And when people get a taste of it, they want more. You can look at that worldwide. That democracy is a powerful. It has a lot of attraction for people because the idea is, okay, we could do this ourselves. We don't need an authoritarian leader or a group of leaders dictating what we do. We can get together and decide. I think it's absolutely beautiful, and I think that we're in the very beginning of learning how to do it. And the challenge is, how do we get together and decide? It's not an easy thing to do. We think of it, a lot of people associate democracy with freedom, and when you compare democracy with, the only alternative that we've known on Earth is authoritarian leadership. That's not freedom. When you have a leader or a group of leaders that's telling you what the laws are and telling you what you can and can't do, and you have no say in it. So freedom is, I want some say in this.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, one of the problems is that we, just on that level of social interaction, we think of freedom now, and this is how I think freedom is being discussed and promoted in a way that's not working, is that I can do whatever I want. And that's not democracy. Democracy is, I can do whatever I want as long as it doesn't hurt somebody else, as long as it doesn't impact your ability to do whatever you want. And that's where it gets really, um, difficult, because where does my freedom end and your freedom begin? And democracy is inclusion. It's that I can do what I want as long as it doesn't impede you doing what you want.
And while you're saying that, the odd feeling of the moment comes to me that the two sides of the political polarization now, both, I think, in their root, feel like there's an existential threat against the freedom of democracy that you're describing from the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this existential threat in the quote unquote enemy, and it was voiced in one of our members in the Sangha, who said, how, if Trump, this person's pro Democrat, but if Trump were to win, how do we heal? And so I think as I'm listening to you, I think you share my sentiment, my perspective that the authoritarian style of leadership that Trump represents is an existential threat to democratic viability, sustainability, continuation. The other side feels similarly about our candidate, Harris. And as many people have noted, no matter who wins, the tensions, the conflicts, the polarization, the tribalism that got us here will still be alive and well. And so the questions that were coming, how do we heal when the other side wins? How do we keep our hearts open when our humanity literally is falling apart? Is the direct quote from a member. And to kind of our language of our past episodes, how do we get our needs met if we're not trying to get another person or a different group to do something differently or change their way of being? There's a few things there, but
Sure.
I think it really does speak to what's happening, how a lot of people are feeling right now.
Right. So,
does that fit in with where you were going to?
Sure. I think let me just tie up that thread about democracy, and then let's address those, issues that you just put on the table. The idea I was getting at is that to have an inclusive society, meaning that uh, I don't have any more rights than you do. We share. There's our Constitution sets it up that we're equals. We're trying to live as equals. We're
Mm-hmm.
not doing a very good job of it, but we're not doing a very good job of democracy. But we're trying. I think we're making. That's our intention, and it's a beautiful intention. That's what I'm trying to say. And it requires. I see it as a spiritual practice, and I think that's the way that democracy could succeed. Is if we develop a new paradigm in which democracy is a practice. It's not something that you just learn about and then do, just like meditation. Meditation's not a thing you learn about and then you get it. Those of us that have done it for a long time know that no, it's a practice. You keep doing it because you keep opening your mind. You keep expanding your sense of consciousness, your awareness. It's not a one and done. And democracy is the same way. We have because we're influenced by our ego, and ego is inherently threatened by other. That's the one of the side effects of ego, is that it's threatened by other. It's the idea that I'm separate from everything around me, and so everything around me can then threaten me, and does. It threatens my existence, and especially people, and especially people who are different in any way, different sex, different race, different religion. Now a different political party. All those things are going to be existential threats to my ego. And democracy is the idea of neutralizing that. Democracy is the idea that I'm going to work, I'm going to live with you, I'm going to care about you anyway. I'm going to open my heart to you, even though I don't feel comfortable with you or I don't understand you. And that's how the only way democracy can work, is if we recognize each other as part of the same system, part of the same nation or society. I think eventually, globally, the same world, the same race, humanity, and then we include each other. Okay, how can we have systems where everybody gets a say, everybody gets a voice, everyone has a chance to get their needs met? And so it's a practice. It's a practice, and it's not an easy practice.
So we had a little glitch there, but th- just as you were saying that about democracy and meditation being both practices, before you started uh, exploring the parallel between the practice in each of them and how they relate, I was starting to imagine, like, well, what is the structural similarity between the practice of meditation and the practice of being a functioning member of a democracy? And I got the sense that you were sort of saying they both require constant work, and they're both, in a sense, exercises that um, encourage the individual to transcend their egoic identity.
Exactly, and in that sense, they're good for us. I work with couples, and that's actually how you and I, our original connection was. You were interested in the work I do with couples around communication skills, and
Still
it's
am.
it's the same. It's the same paradigm. If we think of a marriage or a primary partnership as just for comfort and security, which hopefully it does offer some of that, maybe a lot of that, especially at the beginning. But if that's the way, if that's the primary intention or reason to be in a relationship, it doesn't go very far, because pretty quickly in a relationship, your differences arise. In the beginning, you're just looking at all the ways you're the same, and aren't we? Isn't it great? We found each other, and you like this, and I like this. But that's the infatuation stage, and then every relationship, every nation, every community, any kind of relationship goes through then a stage of differentiation where no, I don't actually like that. You like that, I don't like that. That's natural. It's sort of how we're programmed, and that's the stage when things get really difficult, and our ego gets offended, it gets threatened, and it feels like, well, if you're not like me, then you're a threat to me. Mm-hmm. And to make a romantic partnership, a primary relationship work, in my opinion, we have to work with that. And that's a practice. That's a practice of disengaging, interrupting and disengaging from my ego. And if I think of it as a practice so that I can be lovable or a good partner, I think that only takes us so far. But if I recognize that it's a practice for my own well-being, just like meditation is, that reducing the influence of my ego makes me a happier, healthier, more empowered person. It's what I want. It's good for me. And it's not easy. I call it medicine because it's sometimes really bitter. And that's what meditation practice does. That's what, when you're in a relationship and you're working at it, that's what's happening, is you're working on yourself and you're recognizing all the ways that your ego is kind of interfering with love. And you're reducing that influence, your interference, so you're increasing the love. And democracy to me is exactly the same. And my point was that if we could frame it that way, I think it would be a game changer, that if we see democracy as a practice that's good for us because it makes us better people, makes us happier. It reduces the influence of the ego. Democracy has to do that. If it's not doing that, it won't work, because ego and democracy don't fit. Just like ego and relationship. Ego will destroy democracy and it will destroy relationship. And by the way, that's one way that I'm looking at this dynamic that we're in politically right now.
My head's blowing in 60 different ways. And yeah, I mean, I'm listening here and I'm like, let Miles speak. Don't interrupt him.
Don't go.
Okay. So one level, I think I get this macro perspective or zoomed out perspective that you're offering, that to be a member of a healthy democracy, or to contribute as a healthy member of democracy, there's a need to step out of personal. You're not rooted just in personal wants and desires, but you're able to step out of your own unique bubble and occupy a sense of common good, or a sense of, have a perspective for what are the needs of others, and how does everybody's needs get met? How can there be a sense of equality or equal opportunity within a system?
Yeah, but can you hold that thought? Let me just, because this is important. We've done that before. My mother's generation was about that. I have a duty, responsibility to the whole. And that only gets us so far. What the missing piece is that when I care about you, when your needs are as important as my needs, which is what we're talking about, it's just a different way of saying it, what happens is that my world gets bigger. I'm connected to you. And by virtue of that connection, my happiness is increased, my sense of belonging and connection is met, and I get a sense of security. Mm-hmm. So it's not something that you do to be good or to be a good citizen. It's something you do for yourself, for your own happiness. And when I cut off from you, if I see you as a threat, if I think your needs are going to supersede my needs, so we have to compete, my world gets smaller. That's what happens. That's what ego is my world gets smaller and smaller until it's just me. And that's a source of tremendous anxiety and fear. And there's no way to be happy in that. And that's basically what Buddha was trying to tell us.
Yeah. As you're speaking now, so I'm reliving through a few scenarios. And I'm trying to mention these. I don't think I don't use it as an ego attainment type of share. It's my own life as an experiment in a way. And the gist of it is that 4 years ago, as I've shared many times on the show, I had a big upheaval in my life. I transitioned from an urban liberal bubble of life to a more rural purple environment of life. And I'm pretty confident this person will never listen to the show, the podcast, so I can say this. But one of the neighbors who, and I've talked about neighbors in the past, but this is a different neighbor from any previous mention. But this neighbor is at the end of my driveway, on the right side of my driveway. And when I purchased the house that I now live in, there was a 10-foot by 6-foot Trump banner on his barn. So I saw that banner long before I ever met him. And every time I came to the end of my driveway to turn down my driveway and come to my new home, I would see that banner, and instantaneously every time I had this strong charge in my chest, strong charge in my gut, strong stories of contempt, dislike, and that was how I was oriented towards this neighbor for a long time. And just over the years of living near each other, we've had more interaction, and there's often the interactions are around something to do with shared property lines, like we've talked about with trees, and how do we collaborate on dealing with a tree, or he sometimes mows part of our lawn, so he offers to do that. Sometimes we pick peaches from his trees. He invites us to pick peaches. Sometimes he gives us a box of peaches that he picked. He's older. He's struggles with pretty severe health issues that make walking difficult. And I think it was last winter, and I only did this once. So this is where I can't claim, I'm not a saint. I don't claim to be, but I was coming back from one day from my morning walk, and I saw him. Actually, we had received snow, and his walk was not shoveled. And I just thought, I have a little bit of time. This takes nothing off my day. I can go do this in 2 seconds. And he didn't even come out while I was doing it, but I cleared, his wife is in a wheelchair. And so there's a ramp that I shoveled all that off and sprinkled some salt. And I'm mentioning this only because it was after doing that action, I felt safer and my world felt bigger. So it's an example, and it's a fleeting example at that. I don't do this sort of thing regularly, as much as I like to imagine that I do. I do not do this sort of thing regularly. But it's a small taste of something that it really has made a difference. And there's been other instances where, and he always brings the politics in, and he says pretty inflammatory things. And I have had the help of my wife not to take the bait, but I don't take the bait, and I just gently steer it towards, well, I empathize on one level. Yes, we're in a shitty situation, and whatever is going to be the solution, we haven't seen it yet, is basically how I leave it. But I'm using my example as someone who I have been rooted on one side of the political spectrum. And while my own ideology is still pretty firm, I'm in a living situation where I'm forced to get out of my own bubble. I'm out of my own bubble now, and I have to learn. I'm trying to learn survival skills for a potentially hot, potentially. I mean, this could be a bad relationship if I said the wrong thing, and it's, even though we're on diametrically opposed political positions on the side of this political spectrum, we get on well, as we can function as neighbors. And that's I think it's an important story right now. And I want, amidst all the horrible shit out there, like, the fact that this is possible is important. And I think it just underlines, I think, what you're trying to say.